Hey everyone, welcome to AppleKnows, the place where history gets a pulse and the truth hits harder than fiction. Today, I'm about to tell you things from World War I that sound absolutely impossible, yet every single one of them is real. Buckle up, because these facts don't just rewrite what you know about the Great War, they make you question how humanity survived it at all. Let's start with something bizarre. Imagine soldiers wearing metal masks with mustaches carved into them. Sounds like something out of a dystopian film, right? But it was real. These masks were called tin noses and were designed for soldiers whose faces had been destroyed by shrapnel. A sculptor named Anna Coleman Ladd created these masks so men could return home looking human again. They weren't just metal covers, they were hand-painted to match skin tones, eyebrows, even the shape of a lost nose. Some soldiers said the mask saved them more than the war ever did. And speaking of strange inventions, let's talk about pigeons, yes, actual pigeons, used as soldiers. There was one in particular named Cher Ami, who carried a message that saved nearly 200 men from certain death. Despite being shot through the chest, blinded in one eye, and having one leg barely attached, Cher Ami kept flying. He delivered the message, and the men were rescued. The US Army gave him a medal and treated him like a war hero. They even stuffed and preserved him after death. He's still in the Smithsonian Museum today. But here's something darker. Did you know that in the chaos of battle, some soldiers were executed by their own side, not for treason, not for murder, but for cowardice? Many of these men were actually suffering from what we now know as PTSD, or shell shock. They trembled, froze, or broke down after endless shelling and death. But back then, the military didn't understand trauma. They called it weakness. Over 300 British soldiers were shot by their own commanders for refusing to fight, some as young as 17. It took almost 100 years for their names to be officially pardoned. And then, there's the eerie story of the Angels of Mons. During the Battle of Mons in 1914, British soldiers swore they saw ghostly archers in the sky, angels who appeared above the trenches and helped them hold off the Germans. Newspapers spread the story everywhere, and people believed divine forces had intervened. But later, it turned out the legend was born from a short story written by a British author named Arthur Machen. The strangest part? Machen wrote it as fiction, but soldiers kept insisting they'd seen the angels for real. Here's one for the record books. World War I created the deadliest single day in British military history, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. In just 24 hours, almost 60,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. Some units lost 90% of their men before they even reached the front line. And yet, despite all that horror, the battle continued for months. By the end, over 1 million men were dead. For just a few miles of mud. Now, brace yourself for this, there were more deaths caused by disease than bullets. Trench foot, typhoid, dysentery, lice infestations, and, of course, the Spanish flu, which broke out near the war's end. The flu alone killed more people worldwide than the war itself, an estimated 50 to 100 million lives. Imagine surviving years in the trenches, only to die coughing in a hospital bed from an invisible enemy. And yes, there were chemical weapons. The first large-scale use of chlorine gas happened in 1915 at Ypres. Soldiers saw a greenish-yellow cloud rolling toward them. Many didn't know what it was until their lungs started burning. Some drowned from the fluid building in their lungs while still standing. It was the birth of chemical warfare, an invention so cruel it was later banned by almost every nation on Earth. But here's a fact that always gives me chills. During Christmas 1914, something unbelievable happened, the guns went silent. In the middle of the Western Front, soldiers from both sides climbed out of their trenches. Germans, British, and French troops met in no man's land, shared cigarettes, sang carols, and even played football together. For one night, the war stopped. No orders, no politics, just humanity. Then, the next morning, they went back to killing each other. And if you think you've heard everything, you haven't. There was a tree in France, just one tree, that became one of the deadliest places on the battlefield. Allied troops used it as a landmark. The Germans knew that, so they zeroed in all their artillery on that single tree. Anyone who came near it was blown apart. They called it the Lonely Tree, and soldiers said it was cursed. Let me paint you a picture. The trenches stretched for hundreds of miles across Europe, but they weren't dry, clean ditches. They were often knee-deep in mud, rotting flesh, and sewage. Soldiers would sink into the muck and sometimes drown in it, literally. The smell was so unbearable that veterans said they could still smell the war decades later when it rained. There were rats the size of cats, feeding on corpses and growing fat from human remains. They multiplied so fast that soldiers joked they'd soon be drafted too. And if that doesn't sound bad enough, here's something even more disturbing: trench foot. A condition where the constant wet and cold made the skin rot away. Soldiers' feet would swell, crack, and sometimes just fall apart. The only cure was to amputate. Medics had to scrub soldiers' feet with whale oil to try to keep them from literally dissolving inside their boots. Now, imagine trying to sleep in that. You couldn't. The shelling never stopped. The average soldier would hear explosions every few seconds, day and night, for months. Some men went deaf. Others went insane. One British soldier wrote in his diary that after a week without silence, the noise moved into my skull and stayed there. But here's something people almost never talk about: the strange acts of creativity and humor that somehow kept soldiers alive. There was a soldier who painted a face on his gas mask and wore it like a Halloween mask to make his friends laugh before battle. Others started trench newspapers, handwritten and illustrated with jokes about officers, mud, and death. One French trench newspaper was called Le Poilu Illustre. It was both hilarious and heartbreaking. And speaking of oddities, let's talk about the animals of the war. Not just horses or pigeons, dogs were everywhere. They carried messages, delivered medicine, and even helped find wounded soldiers in no man's land. One dog named Sergeant Stubby became the most decorated animal in World War I. He warned troops of gas attacks, captured a German spy, and even marched in parades after the war. A stray dog ended up outranking half the humans in his unit. But now, brace yourself for something that sounds like a conspiracy, but isn't. During the war, British intelligence built a fake tree. Yes, a fake tree. It was made of steel and camouflaged to look like a real one. Inside, there was room for a soldier to climb up and observe enemy lines through tiny holes. The observation tree, they called it. Soldiers would sneak out at night, replace a real tree with the fake one, and by dawn, it stood silently among the others, an iron spy in a forest of death. And then there was the haunting story of the unknown soldier. After the war, millions were dead, but so many bodies were unidentifiable that families never knew what happened to their loved ones. In 1920, Britain and France each chose one unidentified body and buried it with the highest honors. They became symbols of all the missing, the countless names that would never be known. The tomb of the unknown soldier still stands today, a silent reminder of how anonymity became the final fate for so many. Here's a fact that almost feels like fiction: the youngest soldier in World War I was only 12 years old. His name was Sidney Lewis. He lied about his age, joined the British Army, and fought in the Battle of the Somme. When his mother found out, she had to send his birth certificate to the army to get him pulled out. But imagine 12 years old, holding a rifle, standing in a trench surrounded by men twice his size and death all around. And if that doesn't shake you, this might. There were soldiers who, after being shell-shocked, forgot who they were. Some wandered away from the front lines and ended up in cities, unable to remember their names, their families, or even their languages. They called them the lost men. France alone had thousands. Decades later, some were still unidentified. The war didn't just take lives, it erased identities. Now we're crossing into the part of World War I that most history books whisper about, if they mention it at all. I'm Apple from AppleKnows, and what you're about to hear are truths so surreal they sound like hallucinations, but every single one of them really happened. Let's begin with the sky, because the war didn't just take place on the ground. It was the first time humans turned the heavens into a battlefield. Planes were still a new invention, barely a decade old, but suddenly men were fighting, killing, and dying in machines made of wood and canvas thousands of feet in the air. At first, pilots would simply wave at each other. Then, they started throwing bricks. Then pistols. And finally, someone thought, why not mount a machine gun on top? That's how the legend of the Red Baron was born. Manfred von Richthofen, Germany's top fighter ace, painted his plane bright red so everyone would know it was him. It was pure arrogance, and pure genius. He shot down 80 enemy planes before he was finally killed at just 25 years old. Here's the twist: his enemies buried him with full military honors. British and Australian troops laid flowers on his grave. They didn't just fear him, they respected him. But while the skies were filled with duels and legends, the seas hid monsters. Germany unleashed the U-boats, submarines that hunted merchant ships with deadly precision. They'd strike without warning, vanish beneath the waves, and leave no survivors. When the British passenger ship Lusitania was sunk by a German U-boat in 1915, killing nearly 1,200 civilians, including Americans, it sent shockwaves across the world. That one event pushed the United States closer to joining the war. A single torpedo changed global politics. And speaking of the US, here's something unbelievable: when American soldiers arrived in Europe, the British called them doughboys. Nobody's sure why. Some say it came from the white clay soldiers rubbed on their uniforms, others from the dumpling-like rations they ate. Whatever the reason, the name stuck, and so did the reputation. The doughboys were young, fearless, and often completely unprepared for what they were walking into. Now, this next fact is something straight out of a nightmare. During the Battle of Passchendaele, the mud was so deep that it could swallow men, horses, even entire cannons. Soldiers said they saw their friends sink alive into the sludge, screaming for help as the earth literally ate them. Rescue was impossible. Anyone who tried to pull them out would get trapped too. One eyewitness described watching a man slowly disappear, his hand raised above the mud until even that was gone. And if that sounds like hell, here's something that made it worse: propaganda. Governments on all sides flooded the public with fake stories to keep morale high. Posters showed brave men smiling in the trenches, women knitting scarves, and victory just around the corner. But behind those posters, reality was madness: people dying for inches of ground, limbs scattered across no man's land, and the constant stench of decay. When soldiers came home, no one believed their stories. Society simply couldn't handle the truth. You've probably heard the phrase "no man's land." It wasn't just a gap between trenches, it was a death zone. Sometimes, soldiers were trapped there for days among corpses, trying to play dead until nightfall. The ground was littered with barbed wire, unexploded shells, and shattered helmets. The silence between attacks was the cruelest thing. Men said the silence itself made them panic, because it meant something even worse was coming. And now for something that sounds impossible: the war changed language itself. Everyday phrases like "over the top," "shell shock," "in the trenches," and even "caught napping" all come from World War I. The war reshaped not only borders, but words, because people needed new ways to describe things no one had ever experienced before. But here's a fact few people know: the British Army used actors to fake war footage. Early newsreels were so hard to film in real battle that cameramen recreated scenes in safe zones using staged explosions and soldiers acting as casualties. People at home watched these films in theaters, thinking they were seeing real combat. They weren't. It was the world's first experiment in staged war media, decades before anyone thought of propaganda as an art form. And yet, among all this destruction, something astonishing happened: women entered the workforce in massive numbers for the first time. They built weapons, drove ambulances, and even joined the military as nurses and radio operators. Without them, the war effort would have collapsed. They proved beyond any doubt that society couldn't function without them, and when the war ended, that realization changed the world forever. The seeds of women's rights were planted in the blood and mud of the trenches. When the war finally ended in November 1918, there wasn't cheering everywhere. There was silence. Soldiers on the front didn't even believe it at first. After years of constant shellfire, some men said they couldn't process quiet anymore. The armistice was signed at 11 a.m., the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. But even in the final minutes, generals still ordered attacks. Thousands of soldiers were killed after peace had technically begun. One American soldier, Henry Gunther, died charging a German machine gun nest just 60 seconds before the ceasefire took effect. He was the last man killed in World War I. But peace didn't mean safety. Europe was wrecked, cities burned, millions homeless, and fields turned into graveyards. There were bodies everywhere, buried in shallow pits or not buried at all. In France and Belgium, farmers still find bones, helmets, and rusted shells when plowing their fields, what they call the iron harvest. More than a century later, bombs from World War I still explode when disturbed. The war never really left. And here's a detail that sounds like something from a horror story: the ground itself became toxic. In some areas, the soil is still too poisonous to grow crops because of all the chemicals, arsenic, lead, mustard gas residue that seeped into it. These are called red zones. They're still off limits today. Nature hasn't reclaimed them, because even nature can't survive there. Then there were the soldiers who came home, but never really came back. They were called the broken men. Some had no faces, no limbs, no voices. Hospitals overflowed with amputees and men in wheelchairs. Surgeons invented new techniques just to try to rebuild what the war had destroyed. This is when plastic surgery, prosthetic limbs, and modern rehabilitation medicine began, because of the sheer number of shattered bodies that returned. Every street in Europe had ghosts in uniform. The mental scars were worse. Shell shock destroyed lives long after the guns went silent. Some men would drop to the ground when they heard thunder. Others screamed in their sleep every night for decades. One British veteran couldn't stop shaking until the day he died, his hands never still again after the war. Doctors didn't know what to call it, so they experimented with electroshock therapy, hypnosis, even isolation. Most of it didn't help. Society had created a new kind of suffering and didn't yet have the words for it. And then, as if the world hadn't had enough death, came the Spanish flu. Carried by soldiers returning from the front, it spread faster than anyone could imagine. It infected 1/3 of the global population and killed tens of millions, more than the war itself. Hospitals filled with both veterans and civilians gasping for air. It was as if the war had reached into every home on earth and refused to stop killing. Here's something few people realize: the war didn't end with peace, it ended with revenge. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, forced Germany to accept full blame for the war and pay massive reparations. It humiliated an entire nation, crushed its economy, and filled its people with rage and despair. Historians say that this treaty, this one document, planted the seeds for the next global catastrophe, World War II. The world didn't learn from the First War, it just hit pause. And while the men who started it all sat in marble halls signing papers, the real survivors, ordinary soldiers, nurses, and civilians, just tried to forget. But how do you forget the sound of your best friend screaming in the mud? How do you forget the sky turning green with poison, or the face you once recognized melting away behind a mask? They couldn't. So they buried it. Entire generations refused to talk about it. The trauma of the Great War lived in silence, hidden behind medals and polite smiles. But the world changed in ways no one expected. The map of Europe was redrawn completely. Old empires, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, collapsed. New nations were born overnight. And yet, every border, every new flag, was written in blood. Even the idea of modern warfare changed forever. Tanks, machine guns, flamethrowers, chemical weapons, and aerial bombing, things born in World War I, became standard tools of destruction. Humanity had crossed a line, and there was no going back. And maybe the strangest fact of all, soldiers from opposing sides sometimes found themselves friends after the war. Veterans associations brought together men who had once tried to kill each other. They drank together, shared stories, and cried together. Because no one else could understand what they'd lived through. They weren't enemies anymore, they were survivors of the same nightmare. I'm Apple from AppleKnows, and the deeper you look into the Great War, the more you realize it wasn't just a war. It was the moment the world broke, and somehow tried to rebuild itself. The things that came after, the technology, the medicine, the politics, even our fears, all trace back to those muddy trenches. Let's start with the secret experiments. You've heard of gas warfare, but few people know that nations were racing to create weapons even deadlier. The Germans developed Blue Cross shells filled with chemicals that caused violent sneezing and coughing, forcing soldiers to remove their masks, and then they'd hit them with Yellow Cross shells loaded with mustard gas. It was a two-step plan: first make them gasp, then make them die. The Allies tried their own versions, testing compounds so toxic that scientists were ordered to destroy their notes after the war. Chemical weapons were supposed to break morale, but all they did was prove that science could be just as cruel as steel. And speaking of science, here's a fact most people don't believe until they see it. World War I gave birth to modern medicine, but it also created the first systematic use of psychological manipulation. Military doctors started studying soldiers' minds not just to heal them, but to learn how to control them. They realized that through routine, repetition, and emotional detachment, you could train ordinary men to kill without hesitation. The phrase conditioned response first entered military manuals during this war. The battlefield wasn't just physical, it was mental engineering. Now, imagine the battlefield at night. The dead scattered across the mud, the air thick with fog, and the faint sound of singing. In some places, soldiers reported hearing voices of the fallen calling their names. Superstition spread fast, men whispered that the ghosts of no man's land wandered in search of peace. British intelligence officers even investigated haunted trenches, thinking the enemy might be using sound tricks or early loudspeakers to terrify troops. But there was nothing mechanical about it. It was just the human mind cracking under endless trauma. Here's a story that feels impossible but is entirely true. There was a regiment of British soldiers, the Royal Norfolk Regiment, that vanished during the Gallipoli campaign. Witnesses claimed they marched into a strange yellow mist on the battlefield and were never seen again. Decades later, documents revealed they'd been wiped out by Turkish forces, their bodies buried in a mass grave. But the legend of the vanished battalions survived, because for years no one could explain where they went. In a war filled with chaos, disappearance felt almost supernatural. Now let's talk about the spies. World War I created a new kind of warrior, the one who fought in shadows. One of the most famous was Mata Hari, a Dutch exotic dancer accused of being a German double agent. Her real name was Margaretha Zell, and her story is a tragedy. She used her beauty and charm to get close to powerful men, but when France needed a scapegoat, they accused her of espionage. There was never solid evidence, but she was executed by firing squad in 1917. Reports say she refused a blindfold, looked straight at the soldiers, and blew them a kiss before they shot her. Then there were the underground cities, literally. Beneath parts of France, soldiers lived and fought in tunnels that stretched for miles. Some were ancient catacombs from the Roman era, others were dug by hand during the war. They had chapels, hospitals, even post offices underground. Imagine entire armies living like moles, while above them, the earth shook with shells. Some of those tunnels still exist, sealed off and untouched, filled with helmets, weapons, and carvings left on the stone walls, names, prayers, and last messages from men who never got out. And here's something that shocks even historians: the sheer scale of the animals used. Over 16 million animals served in World War I: horses, donkeys, camels, dogs, pigeons, even elephants. They carried supplies, messages, and wounded soldiers. But the cost was staggering: more than 8 million animals died. In some places, horses were so essential that armies had burial ceremonies for them. In London, there's still a memorial that reads, "They had no choice." But one of the strangest realities of the war is how it united enemies in grief. In 1918, when the Red Cross organized temporary ceasefires, soldiers from both sides worked together to collect the dead. They shared cigarettes, stories, even photos of their families while carrying corpses off the battlefield. For a few hours, the illusion of hatred broke, and what remained were just exhausted men trying to survive a nightmare no one wanted. The technology born in those years shaped the entire future. Flamethrowers, tanks, machine guns, drones, gas masks, all products of the Great War. Even the wristwatch became popular because officers needed to coordinate attacks without pulling out pocket watches under fire. Every gadget, every invention, was born out of desperation. And then there's the story of the Christmas truce that almost happened again. In 1915, soldiers tried to repeat the peace from the year before, singing carols, waving at each other, but officers threatened punishment, even execution, if they fraternized with the enemy again. The high command feared something simple yet powerful: the realization that the men killing each other had more in common than the people giving the orders. And that's where I'll stop. I'm Apple from AppleKnows, and if you've made it this far, you've seen what most people never hear about World War I. The war that began with horses and bayonets ended with tanks and chemicals, and it changed everything: medicine, technology, borders, even the human soul. It showed us that courage and cruelty can exist in the same heartbeat. That progress can save lives or end them, depending on who's holding the blueprint. And maybe the most haunting truth of all, it proved that even when the guns fall silent, war doesn't really end. It lingers in the soil, in the air, and in the minds of those who live through it. So the next time you hear about the Great War, remember, it wasn't great because it was glorious. It was great because it was enormous, relentless, and unforgettable. Millions of lives ended, millions more began in its shadow, and the world we live in today was built on its ruins. This is Apple from AppleKnows, reminding you that history isn't just about the past. It's about what we choose to remember. And what we never should forget.